Hello, viewers, listeners, and readers. I'm Chris Cleveland, an undergraduate Arizona State University student and a Hayden's Ferry Review editorial intern for the fall 2024 semester. I am in conversation with author Andrew Dana Hudson, who is a current graduate student in creative writing for fiction at ASU and who has in the past graduated with a master's degree in sustainability. He is the author of the 2022 speculative fiction piece, Our Shared Storm, a novel of 5 climate futures. It is a collection of 5 connected short stories that each are based on and taken place in different real projections of our climate future, which are referred to as shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs for short. The novel is set in the year 2054, revolving around the activities of attendees at a globally important climate conference being hosted in the city of Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. The stories within the novel describe how the characters within each timeline act in response to the different circumstances they are living in, which are primarily a result of different environmental and political conditions. Andrew is also the author of a series of speculative short stories titled Northern Lights, 4 Energy Futures of the North, which were published in early 2024 and available to read for free online. We will be discussing both works today, as well as the general connected strand between the two, which is the broad genre of speculative fiction. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So to start off, can you tell me how outlining the stories for Our Shared Storm went? Did you encounter a lot of difficulty in translating your research and your insights, ideas, and experience into the 5 short stories that comprise this novel?
Well, to some extent, the reason why I wrote the book this way is because I read the papers about the SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways, and I was like, oh, these are science fiction stories. These are climate fiction stories. And so some of them just sort of jumped off the page from the research. But it did take me a while. I wrote them in the order that they're presented in the book, and each one kind of told me more about the project and helped me see a little deeper into what I was doing. I did have sort of a general sketch of how I wanted to shuffle the characters, because this is the thing that was the most fun about the book. I was able to take different characters and show them living different lives in each scenario. So it meant that the hero in one of my stories got to be the antagonist in the next story. And then the hero of that story got to be the antagonist in the next story. And, you get to sort of play with contingency and possibility in that way. And so I had the idea of this sort of counterposed possibilities and how I could illustrate them by giving these, by sort of rotating through a common cast of characters. And then it was a matter of figuring out, what were the roles in each scenario that they could play that would be best at illustrating the sort of core vibes of that scenario. So, but that was something that I had to kind of feel out as I went. So I sort of had the idea, okay, there's a big business one. There's one that is a little more of a thriller that has a sort of kidnapping story. There's one where they are just sort of holed up in the bar. And so those ideas were kind of there at the beginning, but how I found my way into each of them kind of was, I figured out as I went along, which is, I think, the case, just with my writing in generally, but also with a lot of people, right? Like, that part of the reason why we do this, and we find creating fiction a way to say insightful things about the world, even on these like extremely technical topics, like climate policy, is that there is something in the process of asking ourselves, what is the next sentence and how do I make it more interesting than the previous sentence, that generates ideas we couldn't access otherwise. That writing is a form of thinking, and we need the cognitive prosthetic of the page in order to have bigger thoughts than we might be able to just on our own, or outlining, or any of those things. So there was definitely some plan that was in part just given to me by the scenarios themselves, but a lot of it I had just sort of let emerge out of the project. Well, there was also intended to be an emotional arc over the course of the stories, right? And they're not in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 order. I mean, not that we need to go into what all the SSPs are, but they sort of start from a very familiar place, and then they get stranger, and then they get worse, and then they get really bad in a kind of dark night of the soul, all is lost sort of way.
A lot,
sort of
like just the tension increases throughout, even though they are separate stories.
Yeah, and then you could get a happy ending, right? And that was very deliberate, and I put them in this order in order to access that particular flow. But that's also just a very standard, arc of any kind of novel. So what was fun was being able to replicate the novel arc over the course of the stories, and over course of the stories that are not sequential in any kind of chronological way, that are in fact telling the same 2 weeks of story, more or less, occurring in different ways. So, but it just shows to me how powerful the sort of arc of the Freytag's triangle, right, which we can try and get away from and want to disrupt in various ways. But it is such a powerful approach to storytelling that can even show up in such a strange work like this.
And the great thing about the flow and presentation and just the stories themselves is that they're just a really great way at kind of bringing in a human touch to everything you explain in the introduction. Like you go through each of these shared socioeconomic pathways, right? You explain them briefly in the introduction, and then you say each story is going to be about these. And to me, it's explained very well, but it is hard to just visualize it until you get to reading people's stories within these economic pathways. Like, what does this actually mean to people and to different groups, different, factions, essentially?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to do it as this sort of illustrative effort, but also as an exploratory and critical and deconstructive effort to sort of take this framework that was and is having a big impact on how the world conceives of and thinks of its future in climate change and what our climate actions should be, and try and interrogate it and figure out the ways that it gives us insight on the ways in which it might fall short. And I think in that it was pretty successful. And even though in some ways, the framework is still evolving, and the way it was used in the sixth assessment report, the AR6 by the IPCC, they left the inequality scenario out, right? And they had a couple different versions of some of the scenarios to capture different levels of climate action, and so they're still sort of a living work in progress, but one that I think it sort of was useful to try and capture and give this a little more of that human depth you talk about.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of humans, the characters are very human. A major theme I've noticed in our shared storm is that essentially every character represents something greater than themselves, like such as a country or a company, other types of organizations, and especially social class. Nearly everyone is more, I would say, of an agent than an individual. Their motivations and actions are in large part driven by their associations with others in the story. Is this a theme you were intentionally evoking, or just more a coincidental aspect of your character writing?
Well, I'm really interested in work, in jobs, and I'm not really interested in writing the type of novel where the thing that defines most of our lives, which is what we end up doing for work and for a career or to pay our rent, is somehow sort of a secondary concern to our sort of family or romance or what have you, right? I mean, for most of us that is like a very bourgeois situation where it doesn't really matter what your job is, because money and meaning are fungible, and you're in this position of just balancing out sort of self-actualization with accumulation. And that's not the kind of novel that I want to write or am interested in. I'm interested in who people are as workers. And in this book, I particularly if you go to the COP, no one is there just as an individual. Like, everyone is there representing a company or an institution or a nation state. You can't get an invite without being a part of something greater than yourself. And also, I think in terms of climate change, we can't really think of it as solving it as individuals. We have to think of it as solving it as parts of parts of collectivities. So I think it was deliberate, and also just like where my interest lies. And I encourage anyone who's thinking of writing speculative fiction in general to, like, if you're looking for a good in, then figuring out a job that does not exist yet but could exist is always, I think, a productive place to start. And from there you can figure out who is this person outside of work, but figuring out who they are, like how their life is shaped by that job, and what are the conditions of their labor, and what are the skills that it requires, and the ways that they are uniquely suited to it or not, right? Those are really great places to start with developing characters in a speculative mode. And I don't know, I mean, I think we should be doing that even outside of the speculative mode, but I certainly won't begrudge people trying to sort of write about the family or the friendship or whatever. But I think work really matters, so that probably is part of why I did it like this.
Yeah, I think it's hard for I would say it's hard for writers and readers alike to find what's cool about the non-typical heroes, right? Like, what's the part of intrigue? Because there can be intrigue in anything, right? And we kind of, in a lot of stories, we tend to gravitate towards maybe certain archetypes and certain such, where we stick to that and we kind of limit our potential for where a story can go, like what events can be, and what themes can be presented, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I'm I feel like heroism is such a tricky thing to think of in terms of climate change, because unless you're like heroically going out and like chaining yourself to the tracks that move the coal, most of the people who are making things happen in this space are heroic, like, bureaucrats, right? And my sort of focus when I do speculative thinking is often political and economic, and the scientific, technological aspects are secondary. So I don't have a lot of like heroic and a lot of protagonist engineers or scientists. It's usually the negotiators, the salespeople, the hustlers, the entrepreneurs, the diplomats and bureaucrats, and that it does seem like in the world as a whole that managerial class is where all is sort of the crux of making any of this stuff happen, unless we're if you're not actually a plutocrat, right? So and I don't the plutocrats show up in my stories, but it's hard for me to get into that headspace because they're so alien and so different from you and I. So I had to sort of mostly keep the perspective on the people who are regular, actual people who end up surrounding that space.
Yeah. I guess instead of looking at it in terms of like who's heroes and villains, I believe you mentioned that different future scenarios, they kind of depict more so who's the different winners and the different losers of each. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the useful things about using scenarios to guide any kind of futures thinking, right? It's not utopia or dystopia, because one man's utopia is another man's dystopia. Yeah. It's who's the winner, who's the loser, and what are the normative choices that we have to make to decide whether or not we think this is like a good place to be. These are mostly, the normativity is pretty clear. But I think in futures thinking in general, that's not always the case. Like there's compelling reasons to choose, one social or infrastructural design. There's compelling reasons to choose a totally different one, and people are going to be pleased or have a different life way empowered by it. So it's being able to use this as a tool to allow us collectively to decide what kind of world we actually want to live in is, for me, always been a large value and focus.
So shifting discussion a bit for now, let's talk a bit about Northern Lights, the writing process for which was very different in comparison to Our Shared Storm. You reflected on this process within a short article provided in the introductory sections of the text. Like Our Shared Storm, it centers around several short stories representing different timelines, yet it's a much more collaborative text where much of the outline was generated through workshop discussions you co-hosted at the Luleå University of Technology in Sweden. One aspect that wasn't quite clear to me was how it was decided which ideas would be included in the final text and which would be cut. Can you elaborate on this? And just curious, did you have any veto power as it was?
Well, it was a really interesting project. I got asked by some scholars at LTU in Luleå, which is way up in northern Sweden near the Arctic Circle, to come and do an energy futures project that was partially inspired by Our Shared Storm and the work that we did there, but also partially inspired by work I had done at ASU in a series of energy futures or solar futures, narrative hackathons hosted by the Center for Science and Imagination, and we did one at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado. And these produced a couple books called The Weight of Light and then Cities of Light. And those were this workshop model of you bring together diverse expertises and have them collaborate and brainstorm on what they're brainstorming and working on is an idea for a science fiction story. And then there will be a science fiction writer in that who sort of goes and takes that and writes something with it. And the idea here was, well, let's kind of combine how that narrative hackathon model with the way in which Our Shared Storm allowed me to create really strong connections and contrast between the stories because I was the sole author. Usually in these narrative hackathons, we'd have 4 teams and we'd have one sci-fi writer per team. So the style and the sort of set of interests would be really would diverge a lot. So we had these hackathon sessions, and they were really interesting and generative. Though I think it's an imperfect process, and I think you end up thinking that a story oh yeah, I can totally do a story about this, and then when you sit down, it's something different comes out, and that definitely happened here. There was some of the workshops that there was one workshop that where it took us just sort of didn't work with the rest of the project, and I decided to take that on my own, and there was one that where we sort of mulled over a bunch of stuff and had a lot of cool world building ideas, but the way that I ended up approaching them was sort of different from how we were conceiving in the room that day. And that's just part of the process, and it was so wonderful to work with collaborators that were interested in my artistic creative production and not necessarily in sort of getting just sort of a right for hire type of product, right, where they hand you like plot points. And so yeah, and in the end I think that, you know, we produced something that worked for all of us, even though there was definitely some tension between the stories I came up with and, you know, the original goals of the project, right? And we sort of had to evolve that a little bit and figure out how to meet how to make the stories kind of meet those goals part way and vice versa. So in the end, I think it's like a really interesting text. The stories all have a lot to say about how wind energy might shape our society, or the rituals that we might develop around renewable energy going forward, or the ways in which rewilding and different types of land use reform can shape society over a long time period, and what are the different perspectives on that. So all that ended up in there, and I think it's got a lot to chew on, even though it's maybe a little more difficult as like a pure as a pure pedagogical kind of text that tells you, what to do and how to think, right? It's a little more challenging than that.
Yeah. And people definitely took interest in it. It was mentioned in the introduction that several external organizations were interested, in the work while you guys were creating it. So at the time of this interview, we're just over 2.5 years out from our Shared Storms publication, and we're about a year from the writing of Northern Lights. So now, retrospectively, do you have any desire to flesh out any one of these stories more? Or do you feel you sufficiently got your point across for each, and further elaboration on any of the ideas or characters or events doesn't feel meaningful?
Well, yeah, I'm not going to do sequels or anything like that. I think if there's sort of questions in a similar space, those can show up in other stories. But then it's the nature of the publishing process that at a certain point, on most books, right, you sort of hit the done stamp and move on, and then it's out of your hands, and you unless you're, except in certain circumstances, it's really hard to revisit, and also it's by then you've moved on to other projects. So yeah. Also, I sort of think that we shouldn't think of short stories as being the nuggets that are only successful if they turn into longer works. I think short fiction and these are all sort of 5,000 to 10,000 words. I think that's a form that can tell a complete story and feel really full, and should not be thought of as this sort of sketch that needs to be filled in. So I'm a big partisan of the short fiction form. I've worked outside of it, but I think that a lot of the works that I have found most challenging I've found challenging because of all the negative space that is left around it, and in a way that's remains fairly deliberate. So I remember Kim Stanley Robinson, one of our great science fiction writers, he once told me that a short story should be moving a giant block of concrete 1 inch, but it lands on your toe. And that has remained this really powerful metaphor for how you don't have to have a lot of plot and twists and turns and like world stakes in a short story, but they can still be really emotionally and intellectually impactful. But it's still really hard because we, read a lot of novels and watch a lot of movies that have and TV shows and all these things where the movements of the plot are the thing that like binds you into the ideas. So
we just love seeing just a nice long arc, seeing it from start.
Yeah, it's very satisfying to come to the end of that, and or to feel the end coming, even when the end is like unsatisfying, right? Like we've all experienced like franchises that end poorly or end up in disappointing places, but along the way, the arcness of it was like God drew us in. But short fiction is really powerful, and I mean, in science fiction and fantasy, it's an incredibly vibrant space. So I hope that students can learn how to begin to work in that mode, because it'll make your novels better, right? If you can figure out how to tell a complete story in 4,000 or 5,000 words, that'll make you better at telling a story in 75 to 100,000 words, right? Or in multiple books.
There's definitely some benefit of practicing being concise. I definitely learned that in a lot of my creative writing English classes, to be concise as possible, and then, but then again, you still want to. It still is very tempting to for creative writing to just play around with the characters and see what places they can take them.
Yeah, I mean it's the fat that makes the steak taste good, right? And so trimming out every unnecessary thing is going to make your novel not as fun.
Yeah. Also thinking retrospectively on Our Shared Storm and as well as Northern Lights. I'm just curious if you remember any critique or comments from readers that perhaps changed your view on anything, on either work.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about writing any kind of book is that, at least for me, I don't know everything that it's about until it's done and published, and I have to go out and start talking about it, and people ask me questions. So I've done a lot of thinking about how to conceive of Our Shared Storm after it was done and the manuscript was sort of signed off on and headed to print, right? Just through the process of going on book tour and talking about it. I mean, I think one interesting thing that I'm still wrestling with is a couple reviewers said that the sort of happy ending was a little didactic, right? Was a little sort of, here's what we should do, right? And sort of teaching, telling us the right choices to make.
Yeah.
And I quibble with that a little bit, but I also sort of feel like that's very common to the form of like trying to describe a utopian scenario, and one that is, I think, a barrier to it breaking out into a larger sort of mainstream interest. And so it's been one that since then I've been kind of like checking myself a little bit, like, am I being didactic with this? Can I find a way to do this that is to articulate this idea that is like tricks the reader into arriving at it of their own accord. And that's just a really fun and challenging way to get at things. Anyway.
One thing I did really appreciate about that story is that it wasn't just like, oh, here's the utopia, here's it, all of our problems are good here. It's there's a lot of nuance to it. There's still like a lot of compromises that have to be made between the different groups. And I also just appreciate how like it took the flaws of its history, which is our current world, our current timeline, like into consideration about what Snow's wrong. But I could see how some readers may think, yeah, this is not my style. This is not what I wanted. You know?
I mean, you can't please everyone for sure. It's a matter of taste.
Can't please everyone. Okay. Then on. So, the stories you tend to write are intentionally plausible. At the point of writing, the circumstances driving any of them could happen in our own future. How plausible should speculative fiction aspire to be? Like, is it worth the effort to speculate about unlikely events? Or like Our Shared Storm, should most of the focus be put on likely outcomes, or potentially?
Oh, well, I mean, it depends on, I think, there are different ways you can define speculative fiction, right? Some people define it as like trying to be this sort of realist future fiction, but I actually think of it more as like a bucket that contains both science fiction and fantasy and all kinds of fantastical writing and anything that tries to imagine any kind of different world and take sort of what ifs about technology or society or physics or just the nature of reality and expounds on that what if question. So I totally don't want to say speculative fiction should only be near future realist kind of stuff, and there are plenty of things in here, in Our Shared Storm that I'm not sure I would try and describe as plausible, right? And like that's not quite what I wasn't trying to write the most plausible thing. I was trying to write things that felt like they said something about our current circumstances, right? Because all great science fiction or speculative fiction is really about the present, right? Anything we write about the future, we're really saying something about what we're actually living through today. So that said, I mean, I do think that there's if you're trying to write about the future, if that's like your project, which, there's like a relatively small like number of us for, in the grand scheme of things who are doing that. Being cautious and like having a long view of history and having a view of history that sort of recognizes that lots of technologies are S-curves, right? And it might look like we're going to the stars when we're on this part, but then it'll level out, and lots of historical forces sputter out and are overwhelmed by their opposition, and that things move in these sorts of different cycles, and that everything is contingent. That was a really important like skill set for a futurist if you're trying to say something about the present by saying something about the near future that is like not plausible. But I've also written stuff that with time travel and time loops and
the fun stuff.
Yeah, the fun stuff, or the stuff that is speculative, but not because everything is plausible, but because there's like one or two really implausible things that are happening, but we can try and see more about how we might be by sort of tossing that like rock into the pond.
I think there's definitely also a bit of commentary about, I would say, either plausibility or just in general predictability within the plot, where one plot thread is when there's this obsession by society to be like, okay, we want to predict these storms, right? We want to find these predictions, and whoever is able to predict it wins, right? We want to know the future. We want to be able to to make our plans in our own interests for whatever the future could have. And so, yeah.
Yeah, there's a really helpful graphic called the futures cone, right? Which sort of starts from now, and then as you go out, you've got this cone of possibility, right? And in the center of the cone is sort of the actual future, and then like around that, in sort of a narrow little circle, is the sort of plausible future, and around that is the like possible future, or I guess there's like likely, and then plausible, and then possible, and then there's sort of outside of the possible, right? There's the preposterous, and the further out you go, the more things seem possible, right? Like, if it was, we could say like, well, dragons descend on Tempe. If that is like tomorrow, that's preposterous, right? But if that's like 10 million years from now, that's Dragon Riders of Pern, baby. That's like Anne McCaffrey's, bioengineered dragons, right? So if you go really far out, you more, in terms of time, you can fit more into the plausible, or even the likely. And I think what's useful about the futures cone, and that we have to remember, is that as our climate becomes more unstable, that widens the cone, right? There's more energy. It's breaking the cone further open because of all this energy in the atmosphere. And so storms that would seem implausible 30 years ago are going to happen. And storms that, seemed like, we should only get this once every 200 years, are going to happen every year.
The ironic once in a lifetime.
Yeah, and now it happens every week. So, and that was an interesting sort of theme to pick up and play with.
For sure. One last aspect of speculative fiction I'd like to talk about is that it can just be emotionally stressful for both the writer and reader. Like, especially when we're able to make so many connections to our world and the dismal futures that are being presented in these stories. To anyone like worried about their future and whichever scenario we could be heading into, what do you say to them?
I think what I'm trying to do is not be like, you should feel this way or that way, but be like, we have these choices, right? Mm-hmm. I'm always trying to talk to the we. I'm trying to like make people feel like they are a part of a collectivity that is making choices about what kind of world we're living in and will live in. And the more that individuals can conceive of themselves that way, and take action to be a part of like actively making those choices, as opposed to just sort of like letting those choices be made for us by the market or by different like power groups, right? I think the better off we'll be, right? Like I want to see democracy like get its hands on the like the reins of social change and make some like normative choices together that we can like talk about and argue about in a way that is productive and honest. And so that I think is what I'd like for people to sort of feel like might be possible in reading my work. But we'll see. I mean, a lot of these stories do not depict a world in which that's happening, right? But that's a result of choices that we're making now, right? So, yeah.
Of course. Would you say then, would you describe speculative fiction as serving as both, or at least the speculative fiction you're writing, as serving as both a warning and as like a plan or a model?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, I definitely think that we have to hold the utopian and the dystopian in our head at the same time. Or like the disaster that is incoming and very real and very likely, but also we should remember and hold in our sort of head and heart the idea that, like, if we were to solve this, whatever major crisis we're talking about, right? Whether it's, but particularly climate change, if we were to solve climate change, in many ways, the best way to do that is by doing all the things that we also need to do to make the world a healthier, more prosperous, more equal, fairer, more beautiful place, right? So the idea that there's like a bonus to doing the hard work is something that I feel like is kind of in there. That we want to make the world in which we make good choices, not just seem possible, but like desirable. So, but you have to hold them together, right? You can't shut out the sort of knowledge of the disaster, and you also can't get anything done if you're totally just overcome by despair. So we have to live in this state of contradiction, which I think is like a pretty typical literary theme, right? That we're all sort of beings of contradiction.
Pretty typical theme in our lives.
In our lives too, right? Which is what the literature is for.
And then lastly, before we conclude, I just want you to talk a little bit about your newly announced novel, which is tentatively titled Absence.
Yeah.
And maybe how you could see the connection between the writing process or anything of that with your other works.
Yeah, Absence is probably coming out in early to mid 2026 from Soho Press. We sold it a couple months ago. Really excited to keep working on revisions. It's a cosmic mystery set in a world in which people are disappearing into thin air, one by one by one by one. And you never know when it's going to happen to you or someone you love. But this has been going on long enough that it's been bureaucratized, and there's a Bureau of Depopulation Affairs, and there's compensation for people who lose loved ones to this, and our whole sort of economy has been sort of, and society has been restructured in some ways around this. And then a woman shows up who says that she has popped, which is what they call it when you disappear, and then come back. And so she knows all the secrets of the cosmos, right, and what happens after, which nobody knows. And so a couple sort of Mulder and Scully types get dispatched to try and figure out if she's lying or not. And, for me, this novel, I started writing it in 2021, and it's a way to talk about COVID in 2020 and this incredible experience of living through this extended state of social exception, and feeling this invisible but extremely imminent danger just like lurking over all of our shoulders, and not knowing when it was going to reach out and get us, and not really having that much control about it, right? And all the ways in which society shifted very rapidly and often in very banal ways. So, and I think there's also some ways in which, this is a parable for climate change as well, and how we respond to it, and how we bureaucratize disaster as opposed to, actually dealing with it. But it, for me, it maintains a lot of the same themes that we've talked about, right? And like there's, it's about work and how people do their jobs. It's about the choices that we sort of make as groups that create the opportunities that we have as individuals, and it's about living through disaster and having hope for a better world. And it's a fun, sort of plotty, twisty mystery story.
Yeah. It's a lot of the things you've been writing about already, just wrapped in a fun, different aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, it's very different in many ways than what I've written already. But I mean, like, I think any author, right? And like if you look at all of your work, you're gonna be able to see the sort of themes that they care about in their next piece of work, right? Once you sort of know their concerns. But yeah, it was super fun to write. It was really engrossing. I hope the next book that I'm working on is half as obsessing to grab me in the writing process. I mean, I had originally started this thinking it was going to be a short story, and then it became a novella, and then it became a novel, and then it became a long novel. And because there was just so much to say about this world and about our world,
which is a rare case for you with a lot of your short stories, right?
Yeah.
As we mentioned earlier, you tend to want to wrap them up.
Yeah.
You really felt compelled.
I'm pretty good at being like, okay, this is like I'm closing this one out, and yeah, this became so much more. Because it was just such a compelling world to write into and set of concerns.
Before we begin wrapping up, is there just any more thoughts you'd like to share, get out into the world while we're here? Any follow-ups? You feel pretty content?
Yeah.
Spoke a lot.
I mean, yeah. No, this was a fun conversation. Thank you for having me. Fun.
Thank you, Andrew, for joining me today. If anyone watching, listening, or reading would like to follow Andrew's work, such as his think pieces and all the short stories he writes, the best way to do so are through his website, which is appropriately titled andrewdanahudson.com, and his Substack newsletter, solarshades.club. I'd like to point people to his essay titled Space is Dead, Why Do We Keep Writing About It?, where he shares his thoughts on that very topic. He's recently announced his next novel, as we talked about, tentatively titled Absence, which will be published through Soho Press. Andrew, is there anything else worth mentioning? Anything you'd like to shout out of yours, of anyone else's?
Not at the moment, but thank you all for having me. It's been really lovely, and to be a part of the HFR experience.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you once again, Andrew, for your time, and thank you to everyone who followed along.